My name is Dane, and for the past 2 years I have been making my own MMO, Noia. I'm gonna take you guys on a journey and show you all the progress that's been made in the last year, and I'm also gonna total up all the expenses that went into it along the way. So let's get into this. Now, when I started this project, I laid out 2 rules for myself that would help keep me on track, so even on the tough days, progress would still be made. Rule number 1, no 0 days. I have to do something to move the game forward every single day. And rule number 2, I have to release a devlog every 2 weeks. These 2 rules are set in stone, no exceptions. And as you can see from my upload schedule and my Discord channels, there is no sign of me slowing down. In the first year, I got a lot of stuff done, and Noia went live. It is currently in open alpha, and you can all play right now on web, PC, Linux, and Android. A link to the itch.io page where you can play Noia, as well as a link to the year 1 development video, is in the description. At the end of last year, the total development cost for Noia was just under $1,300, and I had just begun work on the first instanced dungeon for Noia, the Catacombs of the Lost. So let's start there. With the general outline of the dungeon already roughed in, I wanted to populate the dungeon with a few different monster types. This dungeon is meant to teach the new players about various enemy types and mechanics. The first group of archers at the start here can call each other for help, and the archer mini-boss has this random area attack that teaches the players to stay out of glowing circles. Further on is the cast-a-tree mini-boss that has this wide area of attack that follows the target around. This is meant to teach the players that someone's going to get hit, so plan accordingly and aim those boss attacks away from the party. The next room teaches the final lesson of the dungeon. Some monsters can charge at you, dealing damage to everyone in the path, and the dungeon boss takes all of these lessons and combines them into one big final test. Area attacks from the sky, wide frontal sprays, and a devastating charge. Now that I had monsters and mechanics, I needed to give players something for actually clearing their first dungeon. Since this is the very first dungeon the players would encounter, I didn't want the players to have to grind for a weapon upgrade this early in the game. So rather than boss loot, I made a quest requiring the players to kill each one of these 3 bosses, and the player could then pick which weapon upgrade they would like. These crystal weapons are the first weapons to come with weapon skills attached. That's a special move that the player can use while they have that particular weapon equipped. The sword gets a spiky AoE, the shield gets a 50-point shield, the bow gets a piercing arrow, the wand gets this exploding crystal spike, and the staff gets a big HP regen spell. I finished up June by creating this admin NPC called Jeebs. Jeebs has the ability to power level players as well as reset stats. He's around just during this alpha and beta testing phase, so players can test various weapons and features quickly without having to grind levels over and over again. Now, July was a historic month for Noia. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, there were some definite decisions made this month that would shape the future of Noia forever, namely in the art department. I'll get to that in a second. I made a small single-player story dungeon that players get to play through in order to make it out of the underworld. Here, they meet the Queen's guardian, Halia, for the first time. After a short skirmish with Halia, the Queen herself appears and takes a particular interest in the player for some strange reason. A friend of mine also recorded the voice lines for the Queen, and she knocked it out of the park. Here's a small sample.
You come to my domain, assault my servants, stir the restless dead, and now seek to leave without so much of a word to your host? No.
Up until now, I had been trying, and mostly failing, to make my own art for Noia. I am not an artist, and attempting to draw drains my energy faster than anything. I found some limited success using a cool program called Smack Studio to help visualize perspectives, but in the end it was just a tool, not a solution. And if I couldn't feed the tool good art to begin with, it wasn't going to magically make my art any better. Thankfully, there were a few artists really active in the art submissions channel in the Discord. Two of them, Mao and Netherfang. They had drawn their own renditions of the Queen of the Underworld. Both were fantastic, but in the end, I could only pick one, and I really liked the direction that Mao was going, so I asked him if he'd be willing to work with me to expand on his initial drawing. We worked out a price structure and got to work. Mao further refined the Queen's sprite to what we have today, and I could not be happier. Now, despite all these awesome things happening in the art department for Noia, I was still having some issues with players getting stuck at the very beginning of the game. Players weren't really sure what to do when they got control of their character, so I wrapped up July with creating some tutorial pop-up windows that would nudge the player along in the first opening minutes of the game, teaching them about talking to NPCs, as well as the inventory and quest windows. This would definitely solve all my problems with stuck players at the beginning of the game. Now, at the start of August, I created a logging system for Noia. Up until now, if something happened and I wasn't looking directly at the server console, I never saw it. So I got to dip my toes into multi-threaded programming. Multi-thread programming is kind of dangerous to use, especially if you have no idea what you're doing, like me, for instance. But thankfully, I wasn't going to be using it for anything too complicated. I just needed to spin off a second thread to write logs to the server hard disk. My first attempt at writing a logger did not go well. After generating 1 million test events, my code managed to write only 100,000 lines to the disk in 30 seconds. That's really bad. After getting slapped around on Reddit for a few hours, I learned how to properly write large amounts of logs to a file, and my next iteration of the logger wrote all 1 million entries in 4 seconds. Much better. Thanks, Reddit. With that done, I started adding log entries for pretty much everything. Combat, chat, potential exploits, everything. You name it, I got logs for it. While this was going on, there was also a lot more people that were starting to throw art submissions into the Discord for Noia. And while that is good, not a lot of the submissions really worked for Noia's art style. And then I realized, no one knew what Noia's art style was, including me. So I reached back out to Mao for help. Here's the thing about Mao. He isn't just a pixel artist. He's a career artist. He's done children's books, backgrounds, concept art, animation, tattoos, everything. Mao was going to help me in creating a solidified art style for Noia. And over the next few weeks, Mao and I went over everything. Player sprites, overhauling a bunch of monster sprites, adding to the color palette, and a new look for Halia as well. After all of that, Mao created what I'm calling the Noia Art Design Doc, a comprehensive set of rules and guidelines for creating art for Noia. September was a fun month because I got to do code stuff, and I like doing code stuff. I whipped up a simple friends system, so now players can right-click and add one another to their friends lists. Simple as that. The friends window allows for easy party invites and chatting, nothing too crazy. What was crazy was the next thing I made, the mobile UI for Noia. It was always part of the plan to have an Android and iOS client for Noia someday, but I was getting more and more requests for a mobile client, so I figured, why not now? My issue was a matter of UI real estate. The web and PC clients have this 10-button hotbar that works really well for web and PC, but would be way too small for mobile. Luckily, someone already solved this issue for me, MapleM. They too have a 10-button hotbar system, but they split the hotbar into 2 sets of 5, with a swap button to flip between each set of 5 hotkeys. Pretty good idea. So I implemented that same idea into my own mobile UI. That way, no matter what platform the players are on, the hotkey count stays the same. And with that, Noia now had a rudimentary mobile client for Android devices. Why no iOS client? Well, I don't have a Mac, and you need a Mac in order to compile an iOS client, so no iOS client yet. Also in September, I reached back out to Clockwork Raven to commission him to start work on a beehive-themed tile set for an upcoming dungeon that I had planned. If you haven't watched the first year devlog, let me explain. Clockwork Raven is the artist for all the world tile sets that I used for Noia, and I like to support him via Patreon, hence the $10 every month. I've commissioned him for art in the past, namely the Underworld tile set and the Noia logo, so while Raven got started on the beehive tile set, I got to work on making some more class-defining skills for each of the 4 weapon types. Wand users got a new mark and recall ability to give themselves some strategic mobility, while inside this circle they get a nice DPS buff, and if they cast the skill again, they teleport back to the center of the circle. If you play Final Fantasy XIV, you can probably see where I got the inspiration for this spell. Bow users gained a battery of traps that they can play around with to either immobilize their target or just deal some extra damage. Sword wielders got their first taunt and a charge ability to quickly initiate battles, and the staff, in keeping with the light-based caster trope, gained a big friggin' laser beam. And how is that a healer spell? Well, the way I see it, killing monsters faster keeps the party alive. These new skills were meant to bring out the individual personality of each weapon type, and I think they worked out pretty good. Moving on. Now that I had a mobile client for the game, I was able to get some feedback from my family. They all knew I was making a game, but they never really had a chance to play it yet. Watching them stumble through the start of the game pointed out some more glaring issues. Number one, for mobile specifically, there was nothing to indicate if something was interactable or not. On web and PC clients, players can mouse over objects and they highlight, but there's no mouse on mobile. So I made a proximity collider for all objects and a text pop-up to show what button to press. This also helps with players who get stuck in the beginning seconds of the game. Not everyone understood they were supposed to talk to Dan, the talking skull here, and now if they try and walk off, a short cutscene plays that forces the player directly back in front of Dan, and that new interaction pop-up will happen. I don't necessarily like to use cutscenes to force a player action, but this one time I think it's the right decision. Another issue that popped up is while questing, there was no indication on progress being made on said quest. I had this tiny quest tracker at the top right-hand corner of the screen, but it's really easy to miss, so to fix this I added a small text pop-up that appears whenever there's progress on a quest objective. Speaking of quests, I was also able to get a ton of quests in the game for the forest map, 5 entire quest lines actually. There's a secret hidden quest line to find out what's eating all the fish in the river, Rhonda and her glamping adventure, Norman and Elva and their sunflower farm, and the Sprites and Fairies quest line. Norman's quests and the fairy quest both tie into the main storyline of Noia, or at least into the main storyline of the forest. The bees of the hive are getting a bit more aggressive day by day, and it's up to the player to discover why. And if you thought that I would make a questline about bees and not make all the quest names bee puns, boy are you in for a bad time. I am a dad, and I'm gonna make it everybody's problem. Players even get to turn into a cute little bee so they can safely explore the hive. Yep. I added transformations into Noia. Not only is it fun to be able to transform into different creatures and use those creatures' abilities, but I can also use these transformations in the future if I want to give the player a chance to play through, say, a flashback as a powerful historical figure, rather than just watching a cutscene. I'm pretty excited to play around with these transformations in the future. In November, I created what I call ring events, or at least that's what they were called in EverQuest 2. In EverQuest 2, there were these certain monsters that just seemed a little out of place, and when the player killed them, they would trigger a couple waves of monsters culminating in a boss fight. And now we have the same thing for Noia. There were a few issues getting it to work, nothing I couldn't handle. It definitely works now, and I can sprinkle all these hidden bosses throughout the world. Not every boss will be hidden behind a ring event, but it is a nice tool to have. I also made everyone's favorite quest type, escort quests. Hold on, wait, I can't explain. The escort NPC takes on the player's movement speed, so none of this too slow nonsense, and the NPC is invulnerable during the quest, so the player only has to worry about themselves. The quest NPC, however, will stop following if there's, say, an ambush that just so happens to occur, and the player will have to deal with that first before moving on. In December, I added more quest features to Noia. There's this capture quest where the players have to whittle a monster's HP down to 25% and then use a capture item on the monsters. This is currently used in game with the sprite NPC Chantrell wants the players to capture frogs in hopes that one of them turns out to be a prince. Spoilers, they're just normal frogs. But the pixie NPC Lily feels that she can turn this problem into an opportunity, and she wants you, the player, to teach the frogs how to sing. This is another quest type I added, a way for quest objectives to be required to be completed in a specific order, or risk the quest resetting. This will be useful later on for something like a race, where I want the players to hit specific goal markers in order, or in the case of these frogs, the player must interact with them in order to get them to sing in the proper order. Right around now, Clockwork Raven had just finished work on the Beehive tile set. But I didn't want to work on the Beehive dungeon just yet. Don't know why, just didn't. So instead I made a shiny new game feature instead, a map. This actually took a bit of work to figure out. The map isn't just a pre-rendered image of an area, it's actually a live feed of the area projected to the map window in a fancy term called render texture. I never could get the trigonometry figured out to get the render texture aspect ratio to fit the exact size of whatever area the map was looking at, but you know what could? Cinemachine. Cinemachine is Unity's advanced camera controller. And once I installed it, it took maybe 20 minutes to get the map window working perfectly. After that, I made this little indicator to show the player where they were on the map, and done. Working map. It isn't perfect. It still shows other adjacent areas if they're a little too close, but I can fix that later. Wrapping up December, I added something everyone had been asking for, the ability to get more inventory slots. Enter Penny Pocket, the purveyor of perfectly produced player pockets, and the genius inventor of Penny Pocket's portable pneumatic personal pentapocket producer, patent pending, otherwise known as the for short. The player inventory window can also now be expanded sideways to see all inventory slots at once, so if they don't want to scroll up and down. Maybe one day I'll put in some sort of sorting options. That's not today though. January. Art was done in January. I was working very closely with Mao for several weeks, going over various concepts for 2 of the 3 B bosses in the Hive dungeon, when out of nowhere comes this newcomer from Discord with a metal chair, Mr. Fox. At this point, I had an arts request section in the Discord that players could see what sort of sprites I was looking for, and the only thing Mr. Fox had to go on was the boss name that I had picked, the Behemoth, and he cooked up this absolute unit of a boss. Look at it! Mr. Fox and I further refined his original artwork down to what we have in game today. And I gotta tell you, I had a blast coming up with attacks for this boss. Slams, punches, uppercuts, honey spray, honey elemental adds. It was so much fun. I spent most of January working on the Beehive dungeon and closely working with Mr. Fox and Mao to fine-tune the look of all 3 of these bosses, the Nurse, the Behemoth, and the Hive Queen. And in the end, this is the look that we chose for all 3 of them. The Nurse is a pacifist and doesn't actually fight. She only runs away and summons adds. The Behemoth is an absolute brute and will just smash players into the ground. And the Hive Queen, while stationary, is no pushover. She is capable of sending ranged scythe attacks anywhere in her throne room, and she's constantly knocking back players into the honey pools along the sides of her throne room, and summoning adds all at the same time. It is mass pandemonium. I had to create a few new game mechanics for these bosses. Add summons, player knockback, preset monster movement pass. None of that stuff existed yet, and I had a lot of fun coding decoding all of those new boss mechanics. And now that I have them, I can use those abilities in future boss fights. I also added this waist-high water effect for when players are wading through these honey pools. Turned out pretty good, I think. And wrapping up January, I added a few quests that the players can do to help out around the hive if they enter while disguised as a fuzzy little bee. These quests also serve to add a bit more to the lore of Noia. I continued working on the boss mechanics through February until at one point I just said, I don't want to look at the beehive anymore. I want a new map. So I made the Iron Mine. This map is where the players first learn about crafting and harvesting materials. And in order for the players to craft stuff, they needed a crafting system. So I joyously distracted myself from the beehive dungeon by creating Noia's crafting system. I took inspiration from one of my favorite games to create the crafting mechanics, Terraria. I actually made a whole video about why I think Terraria has one of, if not the best RPG crafting systems. Check it out if you want to hear the ramblings of a madman. Anyway, using Terraria as inspiration, I laid out the rules for Noia's crafting mechanics. Players will be able to have their own crafting stations in town, or perhaps even in their homes at some point, but various crafting stations can also be found out in the wild. There is a cooking pot in Norman and Elva's house, and in the Iron Mine there is a forge and an anvil. I whipped up this crafting animation taking inspiration from another one of my favorite games, Odin Sphere. Upon clicking the craft button, all of the ingredients surround the player for a moment before condensing into these little balls of light and diving into the crafting station. Pretty cool, right? Using the resources around the Iron Mine, the player is able to craft iron weapons, which can then be later upgraded using loot from the Beehive dungeon to bee-themed weapons. I continued working on the Iron Mine and its quests. Inside the Iron Mine, the players can meet these three OSHA-certified iron miners, Gib, Malls, and Dane. At this point, Gib and Malls were just placeholder NPCs, but I used Dane as an instructor for mining. Dane offers a quest to the player to get coal from these soot sprites that bear a striking resemblance to something. Can't put my finger on it though. But upon completing these simple tasks, the player is rewarded with a second-hand mining tool. This tool can break the iron ore rocks, but very slowly. The idea is that the player can use their newly mined iron to craft themselves a working iron pick, which will break the iron rocks a lot faster. Using this mechanics, I can set harvesting speeds depending on what tier of tool the player is using against that particular node. So, tools one tier lower will still work, just slowly, and it's in the player's best interest to get the higher tier harvesting tool as soon as they can. With mining and crafting in a good spot, I started populating the mine map with some monster placeholders and quests. Players can go around and reconstruct these mine carts around the area to serve as fast travel spots. And there's a small quest line involving a giant spider infestation. Have fun with that. In April, I worked a ton on quality of life and polish. Monster Corpse loot indicators, loot pop-up lines showing the player what they looted, additional shortcut icons on the hotbar, a remember me checkbox on the login screen, a disclaimer pop-up on login, monster difficulty indicators, and stat breakdowns indicating where stat bonuses were coming from. And most exciting to me, I added this small voiced dialogue box in the top right hand corner. This feature is in a lot of different games, but the one that I first remember noticing it in is a game called Firefall. The player would get a mission, and rather than just sitting and reading a wall of text, a voiced soundbite would play with the NPC explaining the mission. This was great. I didn't have to read, and I got to hear about cool lore stuff. So I implemented this same system into the quest system in Noia, but more importantly, I used it a lot in the starting map to enhance the tutorial. This NPC, Dan, the talking skull, is meant to be the player's tutorial/guide. The player even takes Dan along on their quest to escape the underworld. I tried to come up with a good voice for Dan, and the best I could do was emulate a popular voice actor, Jeff Hayes, specifically Jeff's rendition of the game guide Mordecai in the book Dungeon Crawler Carl.
I'm like you. I'm a person whose world was displaced. This was many, many solars ago. I was a dungeon crawler just like you. I made it all the way down to floor 11, and I knew I would never make it any further than that.
Well, this is certainly unexpected. How long has it been since a soul landed here? 1,000? 2,000 years? It isn't a perfect one-for-one, but I feel I can get better, and trying to do voice work doesn't hurt my soul as much as trying to do pixel art. So, Dan can now instruct players on basic gameplay mechanics throughout the starting map, how to talk to people, accept quests, monster difficulty, etc. I kept working on quality of life updates through May as well, mostly in regards to UI font. Turns out, not everybody likes the font that I had chosen for UI. Who knew that not everyone would like a pixel font? So I came up with a solution to be able to dynamically swap out important text boxes with various fonts on demand. In the preferences menu, I created this drop-down with a few different font options, including some sans serif fonts for those with dyslexia. When the player selects a different font, it will change most of the important windows, namely the NPC dialogue, tooltips, the stat window, and quest windows. Buttons get a little wonky when trying to swap out fonts, so those don't change. I also worked with Mao and Netherfang to update the player sprite. Again, the player sprite always had this flat look to it, while all of the tile sets had what they called a 3/4 perspective. I'm not an artist, I don't know what that means, but I trust their judgment. So to make sure that everything matched, we redesigned the player sprite to match the 3/4 perspective, along with all of the armor and hair. While we were doing that, I realized that the way that the game is now, hair and helmets could not be displayed at the same time. So I had to make a separate slot specifically for hair, and I created a sprite mask for each individual helmet item. By doing this, I was able to layer the helmet sprite over the hair sprite, and the result was pretty good. Now the players can keep their hair and their armor at the same time, even if the hair sprite is technically larger than the helmet. And yes, before you ask, there will be a way to hide the helmet if the players want. One of the final things that I did in the year was start on the next major map, the Deep Forest, using Clockwork Raven's Green Forest 2 tile set. This will be the first open world group-oriented content for Noia, meaning players will definitely want to be in a full party to adventure in this map, but they can do so right alongside other player parties. This map will continue the main storyline from the previous forest map, so I hope you guys are ready to form up some parties and fight some tougher monsters. As of now, I only have this rough outline of how I want the map to be laid out, and this small little section that I fully detailed out to get an idea of what it will all look like in the future. And that's it. Year 2 done. Looking back, there's so much stuff that got done, I'm honestly really surprised. And I got to talk about so much stuff in this devlog, but there's so much stuff that I actually didn't even get to cover. Originally, I thought that I would only be able to get one map done every 6 months or so, and I got 3 done this year, and a good head start on a 4th. Most importantly though, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for being with me on this journey. Truly, thank you. It has been an absolute wild ride these last 2 years. And if you're just discovering this project now and you like what you see, consider subscribing. It really does help get the name of Noia out there so we have a bigger community of players to play with. And if you're already subscribed, why don't you leave your favorite RPG title down in the comments for the algorithm. I gotta get back to work. So, I'll see you next time. Bye.